Israel, the startup nation, is a fertile ground for the development of novel and advanced technologies, using the creativity of its people in the most efficient way. Israel is also known as the Holy Land. Yet, this was no miracle, at least not in our modern times, and in particular, not related to high-tech entrepreneurship, which is the driving force behind the startup nation. It is the result of a hard, systematic, and unique process. Let us now follow the process in Israel, step by step, based on which many lessons can be learned and adapted to different ambient conditions. The history of the high-tech and venture capital industries in Israel. Chronological stepping stones. Israel, the promised land and the promising land. A country with a small geography, but a big history. Located in the Middle East, with no traditional national resources, no strong industrial base, and no direct access to large markets. A country with a long tradition of education, people of outstanding creative character, and a commitment to high-tech entrepreneurship. These are the special human resources that have made a powerful contribution to building Israel's economy. The human resource is characterized by a quality which is diametrically opposed to any other natural resource a country might have, because when it is used more of it is been left. As former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir said, "Let me tell you something that we Israelis have against Moses. He took us 40 years through the desert in order to bring us to one spot in the Middle East that has no oil." The first stepstone is foundation of scientific infrastructure. It started long before 1948, the year when the State of Israel was established as an independent republic. During this period, the seeds of education and scientific research were sown in its universities and applied research institutes. This was a result of the Jewish family tradition and its culture of investing time, money, and attention in the education of the younger generation and giving it top priority. Be the best was always the message and the slogan. Education was and is both the root and the nucleus. As Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. The next stepstone is foundation of applied research infrastructure. It occurs in the 50s and 60s of the 20th century. The establishment of government-owned, ingenious, and creative military industries and industrial capability was a basic need for a new country isolated and surrounded by enemy countries that had larger armies. These military industries had to develop the most sophisticated weapons and doctrines for facing them. Quality was needed to overcome quantity. As John F. Kennedy said, "I look forward to a great future for America. A future in which our country will match its military strength with our moral restraint, its wealth with our wisdom, its power with our purpose." The next stepstone is foundation of high-tech entrepreneurship. It occurs in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century. Scientists and engineers who had accumulated experience in applied research and industry while in the sophisticated military-oriented industrial setting initiated the establishment of the first private spin-offs, developing new products for civilian markets. These were the first steps in high-tech entrepreneurship. As written in the Bible book of Isaiah, "And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks." The next event and stepstone is when government support policies for high-tech start to appear. It occurred in the 70s of the 20th century. In a small country with no traditional resources and a poor economy, mostly agriculture-oriented. Remember those famous Jaffa oranges? It seems obvious that the government would figure out that the most valuable natural resource a country could be blessed with was brain power, the creativity and initiative of its people, human capital. Prompted by this realization, the government began supporting young spin-offs, private startups, by launching a variety of programs to provide financial leverage to privately owned companies and help them grow faster. It was the first and most important initiative of the Israeli government in this direction. The principles of this program constitute the strong pillars of all various government-supporting programs which followed. The next event and stepstone is the beginning of trading with high-tech companies. It happened in the early 80s of the 20th century. It was the first time when Israeli entrepreneurs realized that companies are also a product which can be traded, rather than only products produced by the companies. In the early 1980s, we saw the first Israeli high-growth technology companies floated on NASDAQ. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, TASE, was not an alternative because of its limited trade volume. For young entrepreneurs, the success of these first companies represented an example to be followed and imitated, in the spirit of, anything you can do, I can do better. The next process and stepstone is foundation and development of the high-tech startup industry. It occurred during the late 80s of the 20th century. The essence of this process was based on use and adaptation of military technologies for commercial applications and products. The first successes on NASDAQ attracted more entrepreneurs to establish high-tech startups. The process was characterized by accelerated development of the advanced military technologies that were driven by the boycott to export advanced weapons to Israel after the Six-Day War. Commercialization of the many military technologies by developing products for the consumer market. Proximity and continuous interaction between academia and industry, encouraged and supported by government policies. A large pool of young, talented, and courageous managers who were becoming entrepreneurs and joining high-tech companies right out of the military, where they had been trained to define a mission and stick with it despite the many obstacles and possible failures along the way. The next stepstone is international cooperation in industrial R&D. This process started throughout the 80s of the 20th century and was the second important initiative of the Israeli government devoted to the promotion of the high-tech sector in Israel. The government initiated international cooperation programs in the field of industrial R&D with companies from other countries. The intention was to create force multipliers for the commercialization in larger markets of technologies and products developed by Israeli companies. The basic tools used for this purpose were binational foundations and cooperation agreements. The first program launched was BIRD-F, Binational Industrial R&D Foundation, with the USA. Many more followed. The next stepstone is establishment of the Israeli venture capital industry. It happened during the early 90s of the 20th century and constituted the third important initiative of the Israeli government for promotion of the high-tech industry in Israel. The Israeli VC industry was established in 1992 on the fertile ground and ambient conditions of many high-tech companies, the deal flow, high-tech entrepreneurial character, and sources of appropriate managers. Success stories on NASDAQ. It was established through several instrumental government programs. The following three programs, initiated, established, and carried out by the Israeli government, were the catalyst behind the powerful venture capital sector which developed later in Israel. Yasma, Fund of Funds, the main government program and catalyst for the establishment of the first VC funds in Israel, leveraged by the private sector and managed by them, with buyout options of the government share in case of success. Inbal, a government program to encourage private investment in public VC funds on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, with a safety net for the private sector. Seed Fund, a government fund to co-invest with private VC funds in early-stage startup companies, with a buyout option given to the private sector in case of success. The venture capital funding is practically the carrier of many high-tech startup companies, the developers of novel and advanced technologies, which are in need of funding. These startups cannot develop independently by a bootstrap process. In other words, without externally injected funding. Venture capital is the major source of private investments in high-tech startup companies. The next stepstone is the follow-on process of the dramatic growth of the venture capital industry. This process consisted of the establishment of venture capital funds in Israel and occurred during the 90s of the 20th century. It happened right after the government initiatives described before, and in parallel with the operations of the first government-supported venture capital funds in Israel. Therefore, following the success of the first Yasma government-supported VC funds, many more private VC funds with foreign participation were established and operated in Israel. These funds made equity investments in a very large number of high-tech, high-growth companies. They specialized in a variety of fields, such as communications, IT, life sciences, and many more. The next stepstone is the establishment of the Israeli Technological Incubators. It was the fourth important initiative of the Israeli government and occurred during the 90s of the 20th century. Technological incubators constitute the nurturing infrastructure for commercialization of innovation. In fact, it was the appropriate answer to the demand expressed by many Israeli venture capital funds for high-tech startups. Initially, technological incubators were a response to the massive immigration from the former Soviet Union, accommodating the large numbers who arrived with high-level technical educations. Through this mechanism, the government encouraged them to become entrepreneurs. Later, the technological incubators became operational platforms for inventors and entrepreneurs to turn their ideas into useful technologies. The technological incubators provided professional coaching and mentoring in managerial, business development, and marketing skills. Technical incubators' portfolio companies received massive financial government support. The graduate portfolio companies became the deal flow for many VC funds. The next stepstone and process was the dramatic outcome of the incubator program. It occurred during the 90s of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century. The government invested over the years at a constant average rate of about $35 million per year. It took approximately 7 years for the private sector, mostly the venture capital sector, to realize their value and start investing significantly in incubator companies. Within 18 years, the government invested about $600 million, a linear growth versus investment made by the private sector during that time of about $3 billion, with a dramatic exponential rate of growth. More than 60% of incubator portfolio companies successfully completed the 2-year program and raised funds from the private sector, like angels, venture capitalists, and strategic investors. The next process and stepstone is the US and European presence in Israel. This process started to occur during the mid and late 90s of the 20th century and grew significantly afterwards during the years, in parallel with the evolution of the high-tech and venture capital activities in Israel. It was a direct result of the accelerated growth of the deal flow of Israeli startup companies, which developed novel and advanced technologies, increasing investment opportunities in Israeli high-tech companies. All this process was a direct result of the investments made by the fast-emerging Israeli venture capital industry. Most of the investments were leveraged by direct and indirect Israeli government support through different programs, all of them based on 2 principles: sharing the risk with the private sector in case of failure, and letting the private sector get all the upside in case of success. The entire process was of exponential growth. Examples of major factors that contributed to and accelerated success: the presence of institutional and other private investors in Israeli VC funds, increased presence of foreign VC funds operating in Israel, increased presence of investment banks for financing before exits, in particular on NASDAQ, AIM, and other European stock markets, increased presence of multinational companies for strategic investments and partnerships, increased establishments and operations of R&D centers of large foreign companies. The last outlined stepstone is the privatization process. This process occurred in the late 90s of the previous century and the beginning of the 21st century. It followed the maturation of the venture capital industry and the growing interest of different players in the high-tech sector to influence and control technological incubators. The result was that the government discontinued the support to venture capital funds and to management companies of incubators, but continued the financial support to high-tech startup companies, in line with the original programs launched many years before. In order to understand the meaning of all this process, which took place in Israel only during a few decades, let's see the impact it had on the national economic growth. The Israeli economy developed rapidly and dramatically and became dominated by high-tech industries, rather than traditional agriculture and low-tech industries. As we can see, during this period of time, the GDP, gross domestic product, grew about times 10. The national expenditure on R&D grew more than 3 times, meaning that in absolute terms, it grew more than 30 times. The total exports grew almost times 10. The exports of high-tech products grew almost times 40. The foreign exchange reserve grew times 30. In parallel, the following achievements were noted. Israel became number 1 in startups per capita, number 3 on NASDAQ after US and China, Number 1 in scientific papers per capita. Number 1 in R&D employees per capita. Number 1 in Nobel Prizes per capita in 21st century. High-tech entrepreneurship is the capability to initiate and carry out development of new technologies. It is an art rather than an exact science, and therefore, there is no universal formula to be adopted, as is by another country, although a lot can be learned from the Israeli experience in this field. It can be adapted to different ambient conditions, trained and inseminated in other places around the world.